Okay, welcome to the first of our Elevate Your Seder series, now an annual series with our spiritual leadership team. Tonight is the first of four. So for the next 3 Monday nights after tonight, it will be at Shul at Berger with Rav Ari, Rav Hodi, and Ariel in that order, exploring different components of the Seder. It will not be a Beit Midrash style learning, but more sort of frontal learning as we'll do tonight. Although I welcome everyone's participation and thoughts as we continue. Um, for those of you that don't know, some of us have been learning Nechama Leibowitz on the Parsha every week. And so I decided to carry that theme through to the Seder learning to look at the way Nechama Leibowitz thought about a piece of our Parsha, of our Haggadah, that of the story of the four sons. So just briefly to remind those who are not aware, Nechama Leibowitz is a Torah giant of this century. She lived in Israel for much of her life. She was an amazing Torah scholar. We've been learning what's called New Studies in the Torah. So this is New Studies in Shmot here. But also there's a Haggadah, studies on the Haggadah that came out by Nechama Leibowitz, and many, many other books. She started doing her teaching on the Parsha as what she called Gilyo notes, which were like worksheets that she started for a group of young kibbutzniks who had come to learn with her for a few months, and she wanted them to be able to continue learning the Parsha while they were back on kibbutz. And so she would send them some interesting sources that they might not have had exposure to otherwise. And she would send them questions to challenge them. And anyone who wanted could send her a filled out Gillion, a filled out worksheet with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and she would grade it and return it to them. So she had this sort of like open air academy way before that was a popular thing, where she really engaged with and taught thousands of people, men and women, young and old, and exposed them to a lot of commentaries. So I'll share my source sheet with you. What I did tonight is I melded together her essay on Parshat Bo, which is where three of the four references of the four sons comes from, and her treatment of the four sons in her Haggadah. So, and you can see here, let me share it now, that because one of her goals was to expose us to new sources that we might not have seen, let's see, any source on the page is bolded in orange, and there is a brief biography from Sefaria about the time it was written, where it was written, and like, 2 or 3 sentences about it. So I won't go into all of them, but definitely feel free to take advantage of that last page of the source sheet if you'd like. And before we start, just maybe two more things about Nechama Leibowitz. The first is that she wrote these essays many decades ago, and so they are the gendered language is reflected in that. I feel like I'm going to try to make an effort to call them the four children, because I think that's what Nechama would have done today. She was a big advocate of women's learning and involving women in text study. And the second is, I think it's really interesting that she had so much to say about the four children. She and her husband did not have any children of their own biologically, but she often said that her students were like her children. And at her funeral, I think it was her nephew, got up and said, my Doda Nechama really thought of all of you as her children, and we hope that you'll say Kaddish. And the whole cemetery sort of rang out with a full Kaddish. So she was a master pedagogue. So speaking about how we talk to children, I don't think is unusual. But thinking about, how we relate to the story, I think is interesting in considering that. And maybe the last meta thing I will say is that the four sons occurs within the Magid section of our Seder. So other teachers will teach about different portions of the Seder, but I decided to focus on this piece of the Magid. But I think that it's interesting that in thinking about, right, the sort of meta commandment of the Haggadah is B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo kashehu yatsa miMitzrayim, right? That we all have this obligation to feel as though we left Egypt. And that I think by including a text about the act of transmitting that to our children is to say it's not enough to feel like you went out. You have to figure out how to tell the story too. You have to not just be the person that it happened to, but the person who's able to talk about it happening. Which I think I'm already thinking about Yom HaShoah for this year and thinking about how that's such a critical component of being a survivor right now is desperately sharing your firsthand story with so many people. And so thinking about the Jews who left Egypt, that this is such a critical component of being a person who left Egypt, is finding a way to tell your children about it. So with that sort of lengthy introduction, let's dig in. So all of the words on the page that are not sources and boxes are the words of Nechama Leibowitz. And I put the word Haggadah for the Haggadah and the word New Studies for the chapter from her Parsha book. So again, I use two books. One is her Haggadah, the Haggadah with her commentary, and the other is her Parsha book. The essay from the Parsha book is from Parshat Bo, because again, three of these references, all of the ones from Shemot, come from Parshat Bo. I don't think it will be too confusing, but let me know if I lose you. So in the Haggadah, she mentions, right, that the text of the Haggadah, the four sons, which we'll look at directly, is taken from the Midrash Mechilta. I left us the Mechilta at the bottom of the page. It's very, very similar to the Haggadah's version. And the Midrash is based on the following four verses from the Torah. Okay, let me make it a little bit bigger. So everyone can see. And I put a lot of colors here on the page. I was trying to code the question and the answer, because as we will discuss, they do not always seem to match up in any reasonable way. This is going in chronological order, not in the order of the Haggadah. The first source telling us to talk to our children about this experience is from Shemot Yud Bet. Right, and it says, "V'haya ki yomru alechem b'nechem." When your children ask you, "Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem?" What do you mean by this right? Right? What is this for you? V'amartem zavach pesach hu laHashem asher pasach al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim v'nagfo et Mitzrayim v'patehu hitzil v'yikod ha'am v'ishtachavu. So the answer, which is not featured in our Haggadah, right? It's not any color, is that this avodah is the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, to God, because God passed over the houses of Bnei Israel when killing the Egyptians, but saved us. And those assembled then bowed low. Okay, so number one, right? The Rasha's question, Maha Avodah Zolachem, comes in those psukim. Then if you skip down to Shemot Yud Gimel, we get the answer to the Rasha, right? V'higada televincha bayom hahu lemor, ba'avur zeh sa Hashem li b'teiti mi Mitzrayim. You shall explain to your child on that day is because what Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. Here, without the context of the story of the Rasha, we don't hear it in such a sort of aggressive way, right? But here the text is just telling us that you should explain what Hashem did for you because you're the one who went free, right? Presumably, we're talking about talking to children who didn't have this experience. Next pasuk is just a few pasukim later in Yud Gimel still. V'hayaki shalcha mincha machar lemor mazot. When in time to come a child of yours asks you, saying, "What does this mean?" Mazot. Right, this is the question and the answer of the simple child. Right, that is familiar from the Haggadah. It was with a mighty hand that Hashem brought us out of Egypt. And then the last reference, and the one that we give into the mouth of the Chacham, the wise child, is from Devarim. So from the retelling, sort of the story. And again, ki yishalcha bincha machar lemor. Right, when in time to come, interestingly, and we'll see this come up, right? Machar. The simple child and the wise child share some language here, right? The ki yishal bincha machar. He will say, what do these decrees and laws and rules that God has enjoined upon you mean? Va'amarta levincha, and you will say back, Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, v'yotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazakah. Okay, so far we've just collated, we're seeing the psukim in their original, sort of uncut, the way that the Haggadah cuts and pastes them together. Now, the first question, and I think perhaps one that maybe feels sort of obvious to us today, is why would the psukim tell us this 4 times? Why did it not suffice to just say one time, right? Tell your children about this thing that happened. Tell them about how God freed you and how he took you out and how God passed over the houses, right? And so now we're jumping into her Parsha essay. Our sages have furnished a reason for this 4-fold repetition. No instruction or telling is given in vacuo, right, in a vacuum, but is addressed to a specific audience. We should follow the example of the Almighty, about whom it is recorded at the giving of the law. As Moshe spoke, God answered him by voice. And so now she brings this Midrash Tanchuma, she brings it in both her Haggadah and her essay, which is all about God answering each person to the strength that they're able to tolerate. Interestingly, even the pregnant women heard it in accordance with their own strength, probably very, very powerful strength. Right, but that's the point here. I'm not going to read every word of this midrash, is that our sages noted that the text does not state that God spoke to Israel with capital H, right, or, capital G, God's voice, emphasizing that to each one, God spoke according to his or her intellectual capacity and perception. Similarly, it is the parent's duty to teach his son according to his intelligence. And she is quoting from Psachim, from the Mishnah in the 10th parak, Mishnah Daled. It was this pedagogic principle which inspired the familiar rabbinic exposition in the Haggadah about the 4 sons on the text when your son will ask you. So I think that we take this for granted, differentiated learning today. It's like a much more of a catchy phrase in education. But I think that when Nechama Leibowitz wrote this, she was ahead of her time, so to speak, right? Which is to say, she's saying, why does it say it 4 times? Because we have 4 different kinds of people in the world. Rishaim, Chachamim, She'eno Yodea Lish'ol, and Tamim, right? And we have to figure out how to tell the story to each of them. So it's not, sometimes categorizing people helps us, right? We have people who are more artistically inclined and people who, are better at looking at the written word on the page, people who can easily play and listen to music, and people who are really good at sports. However we want to think about our strengths and weaknesses in learning, I think what she's pointing out is very valuable, which is that maybe a big part of this whole exercise of reading the 4 sons is not just to say that being someone who remembers leaving Egypt is being someone who is able to tell the next generation about that, but perhaps the whole point is to say is that we all experience this leaving differently, and we have to talk to each person in a way that they can understand. So that's, I think, her first point in both the essay and the Haggadah. And here we have the text, which might be very familiar or might feel less familiar, about the Arba'a Banim, the 4 children that the Torah talks about, right? And you can see now that we've just refreshed our memory with the psukim that they don't match up, right? Chacham mahu omer, the pasuk that we just read, maha edu v'achukim v'mishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. You don't even quote the Chacham a pasuk. You just offer him some of the laws of Pesach about eating after the afikomen is over. Rashahu omer maha avodah hazot lachem. Right here we have the question of what is the service to you, and now we have the interpretation. Right, sometimes things set us off as parents or teachers. Right, lachem v'lo lo. Well, it sounds to you like he said to you and not to him, as though he's trying to exclude himself. Right, as though he wouldn't have been there. And so you have to set him on edge, and you say ba'avor zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. Right, the pasuk that sounds so much less angry when it's being read out of this context, right? That God acted for me when I came out of Egypt, but now it means for me and not for you, because you wouldn't have come. Such a strong, painful thing to have to say to a child, right? Lo haya nigal, you wouldn't have been redeemed. The tam, what does he say? Mazot, right? That's the beginning of the pasuk that we answer the Resha with. ואמרת אליו בחוזק יד הוציאנו השם ממצרים מבית עבדים. With a strong hand, God brought us out of Egypt from the grip of slavery. And for the she'eno yodei lish'ol, we have to do it for him, right? At patach, as it says, the pasuk that we had above, the same thing that we said to the Rasha. Okay, so now let's delve into the question a little bit more. And to do that, I want to also look at some artwork. My husband, also a rabbi and excellent teacher in his own right, Rabbi Will Keller, put together some beautiful artwork, and I added one or two this afternoon. But I want us to think about how we arrange the suns. Is it on a spectrum? Are there pairs? What qualities are really being highlighted or emphasized in any one of these characters? Right, so the first thing that she does, and Nechama Leibowitz is famous for asking questions, right? She wants, I think one of the things I read about her when I was preparing for the class originally is that she wanted each of her classes to feel like a roller coaster. No one should be like coasting along in their canoe on like a lazy river, but there was like a much more exciting cadence to her classes where she asked questions and expected answers from her students. So here she asks, why does the Haggadah bring the sons in an order that is different from the order in which the corresponding verses appear in the Torah? And she brings a few answers. The first is from the Abudraham, the Akedat Yitzchak. The foregoing exegesis cites the verses not in their biblical order, but reads them according to the intellectual capacities of the children. Right? So the first wise son being the most intellectual, then the wicked one who is intelligent but malicious, followed by the simple son who has just enough intelligence to ask, and finally the one who hasn't enough intellectual curiosity to say anything. Right? So it seems like the first option is this intellectual spectrum. And so I think that it's not surprising. Let me see if I can switch us to our, you'll have to tell me if you can see this. I don't really always understand. Can you see my slideshow here? Or do you still see
Yes.
the Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you. I think that it is often common, hold on, let's find a good one, to see them as a spectrum of age. And possibly that is because of what we just said, right? We assume that a She'eno Yodei Lishol will eventually become either a Rasha or a Chacham passing through the Tam stage because of that, right? So age often plays a big role, right? The She'eno Yodei Lishol is either like a baby and the Chacham is like a classmate, or like in that first one, and this is from one of the older Haggadot from Amsterdam, 1695, a child going up to like a sage. So, I think that that's one way to depict them. That's like the Abu Draham style. Okay, moving back to the text. A different interpretation is advanced in the Berurei Hamidot, a book which I could not find. It is highlighted in orange, but you will not find a corresponding commentary. Often her spelling is different than ours today, which might be part of the problem, but she also just had access to a really amazingly wide variety of sources that some of which have fallen out of favor. They're not printed as often, or they're not on Sefaria or on some of the other really good Al HaTorah, websites with Torah commentary. So my apologies. Mystery. But he is a commentary to the Mechilta. At least we know the Mechilta is a part of the Midrash. And the Berurei Hamidot says, he places the simple and wicked sons at two extremities of the Jewish spectrum in the sphere of performance. The simple man is ready in the simplicity and purity of his faith to accept even the irrational. The wicked man even repudiates the rational and is an enemy of society and good order. So I think that's interesting, right? This idea that the simple one will accept anything at face value and the wicked one will accept nothing at face value is like a skeptic, is what I sort of understand him to be saying. So that's one pair, one spectrum. The wise and the foolish sons, they don't even operate on that spectrum. They operate on the two extremes in the sphere of competence, of ideas. The wise son wants to discover the meaning underlying everything to the full extent of his intellectual capacities. The foolish one does not possess the curiosity to investigate anything, right? And so there is an interesting idea here that the wise son and the wicked son are not competing for most intellectual. They're just sort of operating on totally different planes. and they have different interests and hangups, right? And so the simple and the wise ones are the good sons, and the one who doesn't know how to ask and the wicked son are the bad sons, the bad children. Just two very different ways of thinking about the same four children. I am a child of Boston, always lean towards the Rav's interpretation here. She brings Harav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. He lived in New York and in Boston till 1993 when he passed away. Really a Torah giant of that century. He suggests that the criteria determining the order in which the sons are brought in the Midrash include their moral level and their level of activism. So let's explore those, right? This is more like a grid, a foursquare. The sons are grouped in two sets of pairs. The first son is a good person who is active in pursuit of knowledge and meaning. His counterpart is actively wicked, openly challenging his parents on the tradition, right? So that spectrum might be the level of activism, right? The moral level, how good are they? The wise son is good, the wicked son is bad, right? The third son is also a good person, but is less active in pursuit of knowledge. His counterpart, the one who does not ask at all, is actually a wicked child who is so passive, so uninterested and uninvolved that he doesn't even have the ability to ask the question. And so here it seems like he's saying, right, the pursuit of knowledge, high is the chacham, low is the simple son. But the she'ino yodei lish'ol is not like a child or like a nebach, but is someone who is just so intellectually lazy, he doesn't even care. He's not interested. He has no curiosity. I think for a learner like the Rav, right, like that's the ultimate insult, right? The wicked one is at least sort of actively pursuing things, and the she'ino yodei lish'ol is so uninterested, he's indifferent. According to Rev Soloveitchik, the son is not necessarily the young child who is unable to ask questions because of his cognitive level, but rather the one who is indifferent. This structure is supported by the aspects of the text of the Torah and the Midrash. Right, and this is what I was trying to point out at the beginning. The wicked son and the son who do not know how to ask are connected to each other in the Midrash, and they're given the same answer, right? Oops, sorry. Hopefully I'm not giving anyone motion sickness. Pasuk Chet of Perek Yud Gimel of Shmot, the Ba'avur Zeh Asa Hashem Li V'Tzeiti Mitzrayim is highlighted in yellow. It's the child who doesn't not know how to ask, and it's red because it is the answer to the Rasha. So what the Rav is saying is because the Midrash gives the same answer to both the Rasha and the She'eno Yedei Lish'ol, there must be something that is similar about those two children. And it seems to be this sort of indifference, this lack of caring about learning, about tradition. And the simple child and the wise child share this word machar. They are future leaning. They're looking to the future. They're thinking about things in the future. Let's go back to her recap here, right? The wise and simple son are connected in the Torah text, and they are the two that ask questions. Similarly, in reference to those two sons, the Torah uses the word machar, tomorrow. They are the ones who are looking towards the future. This is in contrast to the verse that refers to the son who does not know how to ask the question, which uses the term hayom, right? The she'eno yodei lish'ol is just like stuck in the present. He or she is not able to look to the future, not able to think about, to be interested in questions of the future. So thinking about the four children, I think it doesn't, we're stuck with a Rasha sitting at our table or being in our family. But I think that it adds color to the others to think about sort of what are the things that are pressing to them. And here I think the pictures again start to like add nuance to the story. This this interesting picture is from a Haggadah from Chicago in 1879, and it's the immigrant family, right? The Rasha is no longer wearing Yantif clothes. He's smoking at the table on Yantif or Shabbos. the She'enu Yodea Lish'ol here is actually reading a book, right? So it doesn't seem like his intellectual curiosity is dampened, but he's just totally off to the side. He's not interested. He's not even sitting with his siblings. He's sitting off to the side. And here, I don't know, maybe one of you can help me. I can't tell which is the Chacham and which is the Tam, which I would say is sort of to the Rav's point, is that they share a side of the maybe low and high pursuit of knowledge, but they still both have it, the curiosity. I don't know. Feel free to let me know if you think you can tell the difference. Right, these are the parents. This is the Resha. Over in the left corner next to the parents is the Sheno Yidei Lishol, and the Chacham and the Tam are together.
How do you know that that's the one reading the book isn't the
Oh, the
Chacham who's
Chacham.
reading the Haggadah?
Interesting. Possibly, yeah. I mean, and he's wearing white. Maybe that's to signify that he's smarter. That's interesting. I felt like that was to signify he was, simpler. Um, hmm. So here, the Chacham is not even engaged in the conversation then. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Or he's studying the answers. I don't know.
Hmm.
But he's dressed like his parents as if he's following in their tradition.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think I was letting my bias about the Sheinu Yideli Shul being a child shine through. I assumed like he was dressed by his parents, but you're right. That's probably it. Interesting.
It's surprising. It's surprising that the one sitting next to the woman that we could be describing, I guess, as the Chacham or something like that. No, you didn't discuss it.
No, that's what Myra's suggesting, though, for sure.
Oh,
And he's got the
but
kippah on also.
Mm-hmm.
but he looks like he's the one wearing the kittel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to further Myra's point, right? The kippah, the kitzel. Hmm. And I don't know, to me, it like really strikes me, right? I think because for me, the dichotomy between wicked and X is wicked and good, right? And good is like supporting his parents, engaged in the conversation. That guy looks so checked out, but maybe you're right.
We always think in terms of the Chacham on one hand, one side of the coin, and the Rush on the other side of the coin, but not necessarily.
Right.
They're
And so
not necessarily opposites.
yes, right, exactly. Right. In so many of these spectrums, that's not what we're suggesting. I agree with you, right? That maybe the simple is opposite the wicked, or the She'eno Yedei Lishol is opposite the Rasha. So I think, right, the pictures tell very interesting stories. Um, I was just
I,
oh yeah, please go ahead.
I beg to disagree. I think
Okay.
that the guy that is reading the book is totally disconnected from the family. He doesn't care what's going on. Is in his own mind. He could be the chacham. Maybe he thinks he's smarter than everybody else, and he's doing his studying. But
Mm.
I think that those two guys with the back to us, they are the ones who are engaged. One is engaged positively, and the other engaged negatively. So they
Oh.
they are one. You pick. One is the chacham, the other is the wicked son.
So
But
that is certainly what I was thinking as well, Nelson. I agree with you, right? Meaning I agree with you, and I think that this is what the Rav is saying, which is that the Chacham is like someone who's in active pursuit. And to me, that has to be engaged. And I agree. I think the man on the left looks sort of angry, and the man on the right looks like a little bit happier. And so I also was thinking about the dichotomy. I do think the Rasha is the guy smoking the cigarette at the table, but I think that it you could easily imagine it being the guy on the left, which is really all of this conversation is to say it's not always so clear to pick out who is who, right? It's one thing to say, oh, differentiate learning for different people, but sometimes I think we misunderstand where the prototypes are coming from, right? We mislabel or mischaracterize people. Um,
Excuse me, Rabbanit.
yeah, sure, please.
As far as the book that he's reading the book, I mean, I know from my father who learned Hasidic yeshivas, and you see it in Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous poem Hamatzmid, that yeshiva boys all had books under their table that they were reading.
Hmm. it's such an isolated way of thinking about the Chacham, right? Sort of, as Nelson said, like above it all, off on his own in his own mind. And I like to think of the Chacham as someone who's like interested in engaging, right? It's like the whole Lachem versus Lanu thing, right? Not that the Chacham talks in the Lanu, but I think, right, there's a lot sort of to unpack here. And the other thing before we go back to the source sheet that I wanted to point out is the Rasha takes on different outfits at different times in history, right? So in 1695, he's a soldier, which is an interesting way of thinking about him, right? If he's also characterized as highly intellectual, that's not necessarily the way I would draw him. Here he's a boxer, like someone sort of engaged in like the physical world, maybe is how I would say it. And here in this picture, he's like he's still wearing tzitzit, by the way, right? But I think he's supposed to look like maybe like a gambler or a fancy person, right? And I actually think the Chacham has like a somewhat sinister look here. I blew it up so that it's not quite as sharp, unfortunately, as it was before. But, I think thinking about how to think about these children and what they sort of look like when they show up in front of you is an interesting question. Before we look at the end and dig too much deeper, let's look at what I would say is the other major point that Nechama Leibowitz wants to make, which is a justification that the Rasha is truly a Rasha. And I think it's interesting that that's where she chooses to focus, meaning she doesn't speak about whether the Chacham is truly a Chacham or any of the others. And I think it has to do with being such a good pedagogue. She doesn't want to call one of the children that shows up in her classroom or at her table a Rasha. And so she wants to make sure that that's really the case before we go on with the title. So this is from her Parsha essay. She says it is difficult to understand the choice of text for the wicked son's question. Oops. What does the service mean to you? What is wrong with the wording to you? The same phrase is used, I apologize, I typed this in a rush this morning. The same phrase is used by many worthy men in the scriptures. She interestingly quotes two psukim from Yehoshua, both where they use the word lachem, and no one, right, in none of these cases has the phrase roused the ire of the expositor. Now, I think these are interesting psukim. I think that I brought you the pasuk at the very bottom from Yehoshua. It is sort of a contentious moment. I'm not exactly sure what she means that it doesn't raise the ire, but I think that she's saying that nowhere else do we label the people who are speaking when they say lachem as wicked, even when we're in a communal context. And she says many answers have been suggested, right? So if it says li below low, lachem below low, that's why we assume he's the Rasha based on the Mechilta and in our Haggadah, that there must have been other reasons. And she suggests three reasons. The first is that the wise son makes mention of the name of God, right, which our God has commanded you. Since she, the Chacham, recognizes the Godhead, his words cannot be construed as heresy. It's sort of an interesting idea. It's sort of like when you're insulting someone in the South and you say like bless their souls, right? Or like God bless them. And you're really trying to say they need like a lot of blessing. It seems like as long as you say God bless them, no one can be like too mad at you for insulting anybody because you invoked God's name. Moreover, in asking the reason for the various types of ritual, he did not miss out on the important thing, which the Lord our God has commanded you. The wise son appreciates the positive nature of all of these commandments, whereas the wicked one, maybe sees the service, but not the author of the service. The root of sin lay in man's failure to accept the divine word as binding on him as an imperative to be fulfilled. So here, it's not as explicit, the spectrum, but I think what she's suggesting is maybe one of the ways of thinking about the spectrum is if you talk about it as coming from God, as a divine thing, and as being a mitzvah, then no matter what you ask, you're under the tent, right? Like the big tent of what's appropriate. And the Rasha, by saying Maha Avodah Zot Lachem without invoking God's name or calling the Avodah a mitzvah, makes it outside of the tent, right? Outside of the spectrum of what's acceptable. How to frame your question, maybe is the way to say it, and recognizing divinity. Okay, second piece here. Furthermore, the wise son accepts the threefold division of the divine laws into testimonies. These commandments testifying to the existence and providence of God, such as Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Pesach. Statutes whose reasons are not apparent, and laws, rational laws whose motives are appreciated by all. Right? Sort of, again, a spectrum of understanding this. In place of this, the wicked man sees service. Admittedly, the Torah calls it itself calls the Passover ritual by word service, right? This word avodah, if that's the issue, it is like a little bit difficult, sort of like lachem, right? Because we don't get in trouble for using the word avodah in other places. But since the term is ambiguous and can be used for both service and servitude, we apprehend that the wicked son is using it in the latter derogatory sense. So what he's saying is that the wicked son is being very, very clever. He's pushing his parents' buttons by using the word avodah, which he could say, "Oh, I'm just quoting Yud Gimel Hey," right? It's just I'm using it for service, but he knows that his parents will hear servitude, bondage, right? Why did you leave the master of the Egyptian taskmasters to just have the master of God? You're still in servitude. You're still in bondage. And the Talmud Yerushalmi indeed interprets the wicked son's text in this sense. Ma hatorach, right? Not ha'avodah, but this exertion, this labor that she'atem mitarchim aleinu, that you're forcing upon us. Similarly, we find the word used in the sense of bondage in the immediate context, and they afflicted us and imposed on us hard labor, right? When we're actually talking about the Egyptians. So those are her first two answers. One, right, that he doesn't recognize God and mitzvot. Two, that the Rasha doesn't uses this word avodah to mean torach and not the service of serving God. But this is, I really love this. This is possibly why I chose this in the first place. The most plausible explanation of the difference between the wise and the wicked son's respective text lies in an apparently insignificant variation occurring not in their actual words, but in the introductions to their questions. The wise son will ask of thee, but the wicked son shall say to you. And it's not totally fair because maha avodah hazot lachem certainly is phrased as a question. But what she's saying is that we're going to scroll all the way back up here for a second. So pardon the roller coaster ride, different kind of roller coaster, right? Here, with the pasuk of the wicked child's question, it says, Ki yomru alechem b'nechem, right? Ki yomru. Whereas for the simple child and the wise child, it says, Ki yishalcha, right? Because they will ask you. And so even if the question is phrased as a question, it seems as though the Torah is hinting to us, it's not really a question, it's really a statement. Right? So long as the son asks, however provocative his questions are, it is a sign that he expects an answer, a solution to his difficulties. He is far from being malicious, but is merely a student thirsty for knowledge. The wicked one, on the other hand, does not ask and desires no reply. It's like a rhetorical question, right? That when your children say to you, their attitude is already fixed and predetermined. They do not want to hear or reply. They are therefore called wicked. And she says, she quotes the Akedat Yitzchak as saying the same thing, right? Not constructive questioning, but destructive. And there are many destructive questions. And so she ends here by saying, once the Midrash identified the wicked son as one who is making a challenging declaration rather than posing an actual question, the serious response given in the Torah seemed inappropriate, right? The answer to his question. Because that's not the answer that the Haggadah gives him. The wicked son, in essence, is not asking a real question and is thus equated in the answer with the son who does not know how to ask. Right? I think it's fascinating. The son who doesn't know how to ask is silent, the child. The wicked child is not silent, but still does not know how to ask. Right? Something else seems to be holding him back. It's not a language problem. It's maybe like a spiritual problem or emotional problem. But that's why they get the same answer. I think it's a brilliant proof text for this idea. The response is introduced by the phrase "and you shall say," which indicates a simple declarative statement. In contrast, the response to the other three sons in the Torah is directly addressed to the son, such as, "and you shall say to your son," you shall say to him, and you shall tell your son. As always, she ends very abruptly, right? I feel like this would not be acceptable. Her editor would say, you need to like sum it all up or give us some nice take home. But I think that what she's saying is so powerful and really quite beautiful, which is that it sounds as though we're having a conversation at the table between the Rasha and the Chacham and the Tam and the She'eno Yodei Lish'ol, and you're sitting with all of them at your Seder and you're talking to them. And she's saying, in essence, the Rasha, you can't hear his or her question, but it's not being asked as a real question. It's not being asked with intellectual curiosity, with a desire to learn, to resolve difficulties. And so then answering him or her with the same response as the one who doesn't know how to ask is quite appropriate. And maybe we don't hear it in such a hard way as it is said here, right? The leave a low. But just to say, well, if you're not asking the question, then you're not really engaged in this with me. It's not about the lachem, right? And here, I have to say, I love this. This is from the Holocaust Memorial Haggadah in 1988. Right, and I think the Chacham is the one with the text. The Rasha is the one with the fire. And it caught my eye today because I spoke about fire on Shul on Shabbat, about how some of us have like a raging fire, a Ben Uziel fire, which can harm other people because it's not controllable. And so I don't think the fire means he doesn't care. He's not necessarily trying to set the book on fire, but the Rasha, the Rasha is not able to formulate a question. The Rasha is not able to engage in the conversation, but just to make angry statements, perhaps because there is sort of an uncontrollable fire of Torah inside of that person. Then the Tam, I think, is signified by this open but empty book, and the She'eno Yodei Lish'ol doesn't even open the book, which again, I do think sort of goes to that interesting idea of indifference, right? Everyone can physically open the book, even if you don't even know what question to ask, or you ask a very simple question, but not even trying to open the book is very, very challenging. I did bring us these 4 daughters because I felt like 4 sons. We should talk about 4 daughters. But I will say here too, I'm very confused as to which is the bad one and which is the She'eno Yodei Lish'ol. I'm open to suggestions. This clearly the woman with a kippah on, sort of like that first immigrant story one, seems to be the Chacham. I would guess that this woman protesting is the Rasha, but certainly that I don't think that's how we think of Rishaim in our shul. Sticking up for animals and
Why?
peace.
Why do you think it's not the person drinking, watching TV on the right?
You think
That
that's the
would be.
Rasha? Possibly. I guess in my brain, like it should go in order if they're drawing them on the page. So I was assigning Chacham, Rasha, She'eno Yodei Lishol, and Tam as like the one watching TV is Tam is the meditator, which also I don't think is really a fair qualification. And the She'eno Yodei Lishol is the one who's not like engaged, not even doing something constructive. But you're right. Maybe I mean certainly she has like the Rasha hair, right? But then who is the
Sure.
protester, Elliot?
Who's the who?
The protester. Which daughter is she?
Clearly, the Russia, I would think.
So that's what I was assuming, but I think that
Yeah.
Elliot is pointing out that like this woman might be the Rasha on the edge who's watching TV and has wild hair.
Well,
But then I'm not sure who the no animal test protesting lady is.
well, who put out the Haggadah? Then we can maybe figure out their attitudes.
That's a great question and not one I have here because this came from Will's slideshow.
Okay.
But I could find it.
And the one reading the book is similar to the one at the table, with the boy at the table who's got the book under the table that he's reading.
The one all the way on the left. You're
Yeah.
saying. Yes, I think that without doubt that woman is meant to be the Chacham. But I think like being someone who could meditate until they levitate doesn't feel like very simple to me, but perhaps is meant to be simple here.
I was thinking that the one with the book is the one that's really the most rebellious.
Because she's learning Talmud and she's a woman.
No, not learning Talmud. Again, back to Chaim Nachman Bialik and my father. The boys in yeshiva, they're supposed to be learning Gemara, and they're reading books under the table.
Oh, you mean like because it's Kabbalah, not Gemara. That woman is the Chacham.
Well,
No.
I think it depends on the context.
Yeah.
If you're coming from a left-wing family, then the one who's dressed like in the book, she is the rebellious one, and so you can build up a story. I'm just being provocative, but
No, I like it because I think with differentiated learning comes differentiated teaching, right? I agree with you. The things that earn a child merit in some homes are not the things that earn them merit in other homes. And I think that's important, just as important to remember who the questioner is. It's important to remember who the teacher is, for sure. Even the way Myra framed the question, right? Who wrote this one? Like, who is the teacher here? I think is a very good question. This is, again, it's another famous one, but I'm sorry, I don't have a proper reference for it right here. But this idea, I think, that the author is trying to convey is like, we're all a little bit of all of these people at different points in our life, and that there's a lot of overlap. But I will say, I think my favorite one is from the graphic novel Haggadah. It's the same author as oh, his name is escaping me at this moment, but Brian Gorfinkel, Ryan Gorfinkel. He came to speak about the Megillah, his prayer Megillah, and I'll tell you why. Let's see, it's like a little hard to see it when it's so far away. So here he's kind enough to label it for us, right? That the Chacham is the one who is astute. Here he is not learning Gemara necessarily, but maybe like an astrologer, right? Some kind of science, perhaps. Although this does look like a page of Gemara here. The one who is rebellious, the Rasha, has like lit the whole Beit Midrash or study on fire. But again, I don't know. I think it's meant to like convey almost like the danger in a person who has that kind of fire, right? Reminds me of the books. But not necessarily he was in that place, right? He was there. The one who is innocent is conveyed by this like sort of peaceful, pastoral, setting, pasture. He's the Tom. And the one who cannot put thoughts into words, that is like the galaxies. To me, that feels very vast. Like the She'eno Yodei, Gorfinkel, there it is. That She'eno Yodei Lish'ol is not uninterested and indifferent. He's like almost on the other side of the telescope. But I'm not sure that makes him indifferent. And it seems like maybe his thoughts are just so powerful, it's like impossible to cram them into words. I think it almost makes the Chacham seem like the Tam, and the She'eno Yodei Lish'ol seem like the Chacham. But that is just my own personal read. I don't know if that's how he intended the graphic to be determined. But again, they're all sort of part of the same person. Like there's a lot of overlap. You could see all the spectrums included, right? One where the Rasha and the Chacham are opposing each other, one where the Tam and the Chacham are on like, pairs on opposite ends of the spectrum. And there's so much overlap, sort of another version of this more famous version. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can talk more about it, but we can always reference the pictures, of course, if we want. But I think that what I took from both the essay and the Haggadah is this idea that we have to really know our audience. That part of telling the story of the Haggadah is making it fit the people who are there at the table. Whether that means reading in another language, right? English, or I have a cousin who reads in Spanish, or whether it means having games at the table for your kids, or extra pillows for people who can't sit so long, fidget toys, whatever it is, telling stories or showing pictures, right? That there are lots of ways to learn, and that we should not just sort of recite this quickly and move on because we'd be like missing the whole pedagogic moment of it. And the other piece is that I think what she leaves us with, Nechama Leibowitz leaves us with, is that the most important thing is to ask questions. is to have an intellectual curiosity, a humility, a desire to learn, right? That like we can work with anyone who has that intellectual curiosity and that desire to ask questions. And so I hope that we can ask the questions and hear the questions as they come up at our Seder, and not just read the story of the 4 children, but really embody it throughout our whole Magid and our whole Seder. And I will leave the last word to someone here. Any thoughts, questions, ideas?
Real quick, long points that I make very, very quickly.
Yes.
Number one, I was just in Lakewood a few weeks ago, and I was together with my friend and their son, who are grandfathers already. They were both my 5th graders. One of them, when he was in 5th grade, just sat there and behaved beautifully, never disturbed, never bothered anybody, never bothered me. And as he turned into a teenager, his parents sent him to stay with me for a few weeks. And it was like he had never gone to yeshiva in his life, like he never had any education in his life. And his the next oldest brother, who again is a grandfather now, was a pain in the backside. He was impossible, and he was the one who had absolutely no problem later on with his Jewishness and getting married and having a family, and so on. So the one kid that was real quiet and never said anything, that's one. Number two, I've always told my students, especially not more non-observant students, how my brother was so hurt one time. My brother, Alav Shalom, he called his best friend, as he called his friends, before Yontiv to wish him a good Yontiv. And his best friend said, "Oh, he's not home. He went out on a date. It was Pesach night." And my brother was so hurt inside that somebody would go and his best friend would have a date on Pesach night. And it didn't sound like he was going to a Seder. And finally, along that line, Rav Riskin, probably quoting the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, talks about at least the Russia's at the Seder.
Right. Yes. And
I
there's
think Elie Wiesel picks up on
son.
that. I think he has a book called The Fifth Son.
Right, that the 5th son doesn't even show up. Right, the Russia comes to the Seder. It's a great point, right? The She'ino Yodei Lishol might feel sort of lost and confused, but they come to the Seder. Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it's the one we don't even think about when perhaps we need to think the most about that person. Thank you. Yes, I think those are all like beautiful examples of how complex this is. Any other thoughts? A favorite perspective?
I have one.
Yeah, please.
I read Rabbi Sachs Agadah. He tells the story of a man who wrote to Rav Kook, saying, "I have a son. He is wicked. He doesn't follow anything. What should I do to him? Should I expel him from the house? Should I condemn him?" Rav Kook's answer was no. If you loved him before, love him even more now, because you keep the door open, your heart open, and he'll come back to you. That's my favorite line of this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, right? Just like we say halach ma'anya, like everyone should come eat at our table, all of our children should always feel like they can come home. And that we'll engage in conversation with all of them, hopefully at the right level, right? But that there's a spot for everybody. Even the Russia.
Even the date.
That's right. Could have brought the date to the Seder.
Yeah, say that.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming, and I loved hearing everyone's thoughts. Thank you for explaining all the pictures. I hope that everyone has a wonderful month leading up to Pesach. Next week, Rav Ari is speaking about the role of Dam at the Seder. And that's in the Burger Beit Midrash at 8 p.m. on Monday. The following week, Rav Hodi is speaking about the Korech sandwich, and Ariel will speak about embodying the Exodus on the last Monday before Pesach. Luckily, Pesach doesn't start till Friday, so hopefully you'll have plenty of time to go and check it out. And I encourage everyone to do so. But have a wonderful week, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.